And it's interesting that I earlier said that they're going to be very disparate conversations, but in a sense, our next speaker is in a way a continuum of this conversation of how we lose knowledge systems, of how we lose our ideas of ourselves, and of how we have allowed others to usurp what was the genius of this country, the genius of this civilization. And it's really a geographic area, a linguistic area, much more than a nation state. So next up is John Zubrzycki, who's an Australian journalist, diplomat, and much more than that, an old India hand. He's written many books on India. The one we're here to discuss today is a history of Indian magic, dating back, pretty much to the Harappan seals, to 700 BC, a rich tradition, a cornucopia of characters, of knowledge systems, people, the jugglers, magicians, jaduwalas, who today are completely obliterated from the Indian scene, relegated to Shadipur Depot, treated as criminals, treated as beggars. We have no space for them in our public consciousness, in our culture. And yet their tricks have been taken and are celebrated in the West in David Copperfield and David Blaine, and we all know Harry Houdini's name. But barring PC Sarkar, I think we know absolutely no names of people who were actually the first global cosmopolitans, going from China to every part of the globe, being celebrated there. People absolutely amazed by the possibilities and the skill sets that were available in India, and we have obliterated all of that. So to reignite our interest in that, our knowledge about that, and to understand why we've lost it, and what are the possibilities of regaining that sense of ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Rybczynski. He's first going to do a presentation, and then we'll be in conversation after that. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Shoma. Can I just say, I think you're the true magician for organizing this extraordinary event and all the events that have gone before it. I think it's a tremendous initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Look, I am going to start with a short presentation. If the slideshow can begin. Yes, great. I'm not going to talk to the slides. I'm just going to let you enjoy the incredible visual imagery that defines Indian magic. And I think from my little presentation, you'll understand why. I'm going to start by explaining what my book is not about. It's not about godmen. It's not about Sai Baba. It's not about witches or the occult. I don't speculate as to Sachin Tendulkar's success at the crease after taking the advice of his Parsi astrologer and changing the number on his jersey to 33. True. And I don't set out to reveal any of the secrets of the magician's craft. And while my list of conjurers, tricksters, illusionists, jugglers, and cunning conmen is a long one, so too is the list of some of the more illustrious figures in Indian history that one would not expect to be rubbing shoulders with such charlatans, including Motilal Nehru, Madam Kama, and Subhash Chandra Bose. Not to mention a mysterious Indian potentate called Prince Ranjit of Baluchistan, who caused much consternation in the India office when he turned up unannounced in London in 1901. There are also references in my book to Kautilya, who urged the use of sleight-of-hand artists as spies, and the Mughal Emperor Jehangir, whose obsession with India's wonder workers interfered with the day-to-day running of his state to such an extent that a group of complainants wishing to report abuses of power by the governor of Bengal had to dress up as magicians to get his attention. The story of Indian magic is a long one. Some would say that it is as long as the rope the magician throws into the air until its end disappears into the heavens. The Jataka tales, composed in the 6th century BCE, contain references to snake charmers, sword swallowers, and the great Indian mango trick. Indian fortune tellers were in great demand in ancient Rome. The Tang emperors of China employed Indian alchemists who peddled secret formulas that promised longevity and sexual prowess. And after watching the tricks of street magicians, the 6th century sage Sankara used their principles to explain the concept of Maya. During the Abbasid Caliphate, the booksellers of Baghdad sold Indian conjuring manuals translated into Arabic. Silk route travelers returned with stories of men who not only charmed snakes, but also sharks to protect pearl divers in Ceylon. And the great adventurer Marco Polo wrote about Kashmiri wizards who could make idols speak, control the weather, and turn day into night and night into day. One of the earliest references we have to the great Indian rope trick comes from a Sufi mystic, Mansur al-Hallaj, who traveled to India in the early 10th century and who encountered the feat not once, but twice. In the first instance, he meets an old man who brings out a ball of string, hands the end to al-Hallaj, and throws it into the air where it becomes an arch strong enough for him to climb up. And in another, he meets an old woman who has a rope that is twisted and knotted like a veritable ladder. She mutters some words and climbs up the rope, but instead of returning to earth, she disappears. In the India Office archives, I chanced across an unpublished manuscript by a European traveller from the 1930s who described with complete conviction a Himalayan wizard who could deatomize and reatomize solid objects hundreds of miles apart. A man who called himself Mustafa and who lived in a railway colony near Sukur could empty a safe of its cash and account books from more than a mile away. And at a jail here in Madras, a sadhu mystified warders by being found outside his locked jail cell every morning. And in 1813, an enterprising ship's captain docked on the Thames with a troupe of South Indian magicians who were considered the best in all of India. Their appearance at Pall Mall would change the face of Western conjuring forever. Within a few decades, continental conjurers were blackening their faces, donning turbans and silken robes, and adopting oxymoronic names such as the Fakir of Shiva, the Fakir of Simla, the Fakir of Ava, the Fakir of Ulu, and yes, even the Fakir of Jaipur, prompting one early 20th century writer to complain of the Fakir invasion, and I quote, "If there were any towns in India lucky enough to escape from these specialists, they must have been confined in Houdini's Chinese torture cell, probably the only place on earth where they would have been secure from confiscation." Western magicians traveling to India in the late 19th and 20th centuries filled their memoirs of encounters with Indian conjurers, proving their superiority by engaging in contests with street magicians, debunking their tricks, and stealing those they could use in their shows back home. Perhaps the most famous magician in history, Harry Houdini, began his career at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, calling himself a Hindu fakir and performing two of the classics of Indian magic, the mango tree trick and the needle and thread trick. Thousands of magicians, acrobats, dancers, and musicians from the subcontinent were recruited to the great fairs and international exhibitions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And one of those recruiters was India's very own P.T. Barnum, Motilal Nehru, who in 1900 took time out from a successful career as a barrister in Allahabad to send a troupe of jugglers to the Paris Exposition. 50 million people, a figure that would not be exceeded until the Montreal Expo in 1967 went through the turnstiles in Paris, most of them making a beeline for Nehru's snake charmers and sleight of hand artists. So closely was India associated as a place where extraordinary feats of magic were commonplace, that in December 1899, London's Strand magazine declared in its typically unequivocal tone, "Ask the average man for what India is most celebrated, and chances are 10 to 1 that he will ignore the glories of the Taj Mahal, the beneficence of British rule, even Mr. Kipling, and will unhesitatingly reply in one word, jugglers." To achieve that accolade was no mean feat, because as one early 20th century writer pointed out, the Indian street magician had at the utmost, and I quote, "a withered old ragged scarecrow like himself to assist in his deceptions. He is all but naked. There is a dirty cloth around his loins and a cotton rag over his shoulders, and his whole stock in trade consists of a little stick, an earthenware vessel, and a few baskets. He can hide nothing, for he has no place to put anything in, but he is among the first performers of the art in the world, and it certainly contributes to the effect of his wonders that they are done without any suspicious circumstances." And therein, for me, lies the true magnificence of the Indian magician's craft. They were masters of misdirection, of creating extraordinary effects with a minimum of props. And therein also lies their importance. I see magic as much more than a series of cleverly executed tricks. It's an art that requires years of training and the skills of a Shakespearean actor to pull it off convincingly. It is an art that has had a far-reaching impact not only on India's culture, its religion and society, but also on the world. Thank you. Should I move to the other side? Yes.
This is looking like a practice round for Indian elections, you know?
Yes.
Exchange of skills.
Well, you could argue that Mr. Modi, after he lost the elections, the BJP lost elections in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, there was headlines saying, "Has Modi lost his magic?" which implies that he had some there to begin with, but I guess you could call him an illusionist if you wanted to, because of the way he conjures up, figures on India's growth rate and its unemployment rate as well.
I'm going to be accused of hosting all these
Oh,
anti-national guests,
no. There's very little politics in the story of Indian magic. I mean, you do get stories about Motilal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, who, a few years after, or 2 decades after Nehru sent his troupe of jugglers to Paris, complained in the pages of his newspaper Forward about the treatment of Indians who were put on display at the Berlin Zoo like animals, that they were jugglers, musicians, and so on, conveniently forgetting that Motilal Nehru had done a similar thing, perhaps not as badly, but 20 years before. Yeah.
So, John, I wanted to kind of accentuate some of what you read out and spoke about. So the first question is that, India was kind of injected with a sense of shame about being the land of snake charmers and sadhus and fakirs, We've spent 70 years trying to absolutely change that image of ourselves. So one is that when you went into this history of Indian magic, did you feel that we've actually lost something very precious, or had it kind of deteriorated to a situation where we needed to kind of discard some of it, and maybe now the time has come to reclaim it in a more sophisticated way, but had we reached a tipping point where we needed to discard it?
Look, yes, on the one hand, that stereotypical imagery of India as a land of snake charmers and the rope trick and all these other things of godmen and so on, is obviously outdated. I mean, India in some ways is much more technologically savvy and advanced than a country like Australia. But to me, the motivation for writing the book was to bring to life or to rediscover this incredible heritage that India has, and it's a magical heritage that had a lot of influence on popular culture in the West. And as I probed into the story, I found references to, magicians in the Jataka tales, references to magic that went back even earlier, but also the important role that magicians had in the royal courts, the fascination of the Mughal emperors with Indian magic, Jahangir being one example, but there were others as well.
You've talked about Herodotus coming here
Yeah.
and writing about this. You've had Megasthenes, you've had, Ibn Battuta, of course, Yuan Sang, China, all these places absolutely mesmerized by what we were being able to do in terms of illusion creation. Now, clearly, it wasn't a superstitious belief that this was black magic. People understood that there was a craft to it. Am I right in saying that, or did they believe that this was magical stuff?
Well, I do. What I set out in the beginning of the book is to explain how, I called it a magical history of India, what made India magical. So you do get these early accounts that Herodotus writes about, the Megasthenes writes about, and so on, that come through the writings of Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo, and Arab chroniclers as well. And of course, those very early accounts were second, third, fourth, and fifth hand sometimes, and each time, the stories passed down, they became more and more fantastical, gold-digging ants in Kashmir and those sorts of things.
We should quickly share a few with the audience about, John has this wonderful passage in the book where he's talking about Jahangir writing about the magicians that have come into his court. And it's just fascinating. Now, either it's alcoholically induced illusion, or he's talking about how magicians have come and they created an entire orchard. They put a seed on the ground, a mulberry tree, then an apple tree, a cider tree, a fig tree, and then they're giving that fruit to the court to eat. And literally within seconds, these trees are being created. And then I think it's Jahangir who writes, or Herodotus who writes about the ants that are bringing gold out of the ground. It's fantastical stuff.
Yes, it's fantastical stuff.
But going back to what Shiv and I were talking about earlier, that when you were researching this and you've really gone over the entire swath of magical history in India, was this not an extremely fine knowledge system? It was not just superstition, it was knowledge systems.
It was a knowledge system, absolutely. A knowledge system, and that's what magic relies on, is these knowledge systems, because magic by its nature has to be very secretive. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be magic. If you knew how it was done, it would lose its attraction, it would lose its shine. And also, these are not, magic is a very complex, to pull off a magic trick, even a simple one, is a difficult undertaking in order to make it convincing, in order to make you suspend belief, to think that it's what you're seeing is real magic and not just trickery. That's the art of the magician's craft. So, yes, these were knowledge systems that were handed down through generations among these particular groups that were magicians. And in the early days of, we're talking about street magicians, but then you had a class of Indian magicians who did Western magic that came up in the late 19th century. But look, and it's these transmission networks which really fascinated me, because it is true. You do find, there was a bookseller in Baghdad who published a catalogue of all the known books in the Arab world. And this was in the 10th century, and Indian conjuring manuals feature in that. So these were books that had been, brought from India to Mesopotamia. Obviously, there were magicians in those places as well.
You mentioned this Egyptian crypt, which has 2,500 years ago, which has references to Indian magic. And then you also speak about the Han dynasty finally shutting the doors on Indian magic because he lost his lunch when he saw somebody being cut in a basket. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So the reason I'm bringing up all this is that when you were tracking this history, when did this rupture happen, John, when we started to reject this? Is this the violence of colonialism? Did the British make us hate ourselves? Or was that something we were doing to ourselves already? When did this rupture happen?
Look, that's a complex question, because on the one hand, the British used the fact that Indians believed in superstition, they believed in magic, that it was that there was something, this primitivism of the Indian subject was an excuse for the British, of course, for their imperial project. Missionaries, of course, came into that as well. So that's one aspect of it. I think that as far as India and Indians are concerned, and this is, I'm talking about more contemporary times, you see, magic is just seen as something that is not an art. It's just entertainment, okay? And I think even when you look at the scholarship on magic in general, even in the West, looking at Western magic, there's been a paucity of it because for a long time scholars ignored it because it was just seen as being, nothing special about it. But in fact, it does have, when you look at the provenance of some of these tricks, when you study, these networks of transmission that both within countries and across the globe, you can see it's a subject that ought to be studied seriously. And I think that people just see it as being something that is, worthless or cheap or just trickery. But in fact, what I've tried to show is that even these street magicians, who as you mentioned, half a dozen of whom turned up in Jehangir's court and performed a series of 28 tricks over 7 days. They were masters of their craft.
So is there a case, the point I'm making is that when you say that Western magicians came here and stole these tricks and they went back and they were just more performative. P.C. Sarkar, you write in your book, is not a better magician than the street magicians. It's just that he knew how to market it.
Yeah, exactly.
And he knew how to perform it with spectacle.
Yeah.
So today when we're treating our magicians as beggars and as criminals, is there a case actually to bring that back into our popular culture? And to enhance that? And do you see any of that happening anywhere? When you were doing this book, is that thought available anywhere in this country?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, the plight of street magicians have suffered the same plight as other folk performers in India, whether they're puppeteers, whether they're acrobats, whether they're dancers, all these, whether tribal folk artists and all that. Look, sure they're paraded out sometimes for tourists and at some fairs and festivals, but generally, I've been traveling to India for 40 years, and I used to see, street magicians almost wherever I traveled, and a lot of that has disappeared. And I mentioned in my book the example of Katputli colony, or Shadipur depot near Delhi, which a year ago was demolished to make way for a high-rise development and a shopping mall. And this was an organic community. It was called a slum, but if you went in there, it was slum-like, but it was also an incredible creative hub for all these people. And it was organic, and so they fed off each other, whether they were Kaputliwalas, whether they were Jaduwalas, whether they were acrobats.
So share some of the excitement of the characters that you met, John, in your book. So share with the audience some of the really fantastical characters, some who even went to the West and became great magicians there. Yeah. You speak of one who pulled a
cart across the
a horse cart through hypnosis.
And
made an elephant vanish on a Western stage. I mean, that's David Blaine looking back 300-400 years ago, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So talk to us about some of the characters.
Yeah, well, look, there's one thing. I mentioned Houdini, who actually, apart from that one time when he pretended he was a Hindu fakir, actually didn't do much in the way of Indian magic. But what happened was, as soon as he started doing his handcuff routines, Indian magicians here picked it up within a few months, okay? And they were sometimes outperforming him. As far as characters are concerned, I mean, that was the wonderful thing about doing this book, is just uncovering so many of these extraordinary characters. I could name half a dozen Indian magicians who were household names in their time, famous in the West, and nobody here, unless they've read the book, would have ever heard of them.
Name one.
Ramo Same, who went out, arrived in England in 1813. He was from Madras. His name was probably corruption of Ramaswamy. And there was a group of 3 jugglers who performed at Pall Mall, and they were an overnight sensation.
So what did Ramaswamy do? What was the kind of tricks he was doing?
Sword swallowing was one of them, which of course, you see, I mean, in those days it seemed magical. Today, if you see a sword swallower, you think it's like a circus act.
So it's a collapsible toy.
Yeah, or it's a collapsible toy, but this was the real thing. A lot of the typical sleight of hand routines, cups and balls, a lot of the term for Indian magicians in the 19th century was juggler, because a lot of what they did were feats of physical dexterity. And they came from South India, where they were, their bodies were supple because they were, lightly built and so on. And the best magicians were considered to come from South India. But Ramo Same, he went on. You can imagine him coming from Madras to London in 1813. He wouldn't have known a single word of English. He's made to perform 3 times a day with the rest of his troupe, day after day after day. Eventually he decides, we don't exactly know why because the records are very sketchy, but he's going to go out, he's going to branch out on his own. Within 5-10 years, he is traveling through North America, he's traveling through Europe. He's a household name. He's performing in the biggest venues in London. And his name becomes synonymous with jugglery, political jugglery. You can read reports from the British Parliament where Gladstone accuses his, Chancellor of the his political opponents of being Ramo Sames for juggling legislation for bills and this sort of stuff. He marries an English woman. He has 2 kids. He would have been seen by millions of people at the time, and he was, Charles Dickens saw him performing in the interval of one of his plays, and Dickens, unbeknown to most people, was also an amateur conjurer and went on the stage as Ria Rama Rus, inspired by Ramo Same's juggling. So you've got all these connections. It's fascinating. But there's so many characters like that.
So just one more, because I knew we were going to run out of time. So just very quickly in 2 lines about Amarnath Dutt, how he was abandoned and how he transformed himself. And literally in 2 lines, why was Tamil Nadu one of the centers of magic in this country?
Okay. I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk Prince Ranjit of Baluchistan turning up in London in 1901. He was not Prince. He had nothing to do with Baluchistan. His parents called him Prince. That was his first name because it would look good on his calling card. He was actually on his way to New York to open a curry restaurant. Okay, and he had in his entourage 24 people who he'd recruited as, kitchen hands and so on. When he got to America, he immediately ran into problems with the immigration authorities. Most of the people who he was with were abandoned and deported back to England. One of them, Amarnath Dutt, decided to stay. I'm going to cut the story really short because he was actually deported backwards and forwards at various times. He fell back on his conjuring skills. He was a bit of an amateur conjurer. He started performing a bit in America and then in Europe. And then for some reason, which we are not quite sure, he was recruited by Madame Karma's revolutionary cell in Paris and sent to America to be a bomb maker. Again, we don't know exactly what happened, but he was back in Paris, tried to blackmail another member of her group, had a huge falling out, and then took to the stage in 1910 as Rambuj, the Himalayan necromancer. That didn't go down well with the British public, so he called himself Linga Singh, and which also nobody got the joke there either. But but as I said, what he did well before P.C. Sorkar, Gorgia Pasha, was to blend Indian magic with Western illusionism, big elaborate stage sets, so that he could burn his assistant in a cremation oven and she would emerge unscathed. He would drag, using the power of his eyes alone, make a heavily laden cart move across the stage, disappear elephants, all these sorts of things. Big sort of, Sorkar did this 30, 40 years later, but he was not the first. And Linga Singh performed in the West for a good 25 years, and was one of the top names on the magic circuit at that time. Completely forgotten here, but again, precursor to Sorkar and the others. And why South India? Look, Bengal and South India were the 2 main centers for magic, and I think part of the reason was Madras as a port. When the British came here, they saw, even before they actually set foot on land, you would have jugglers rowing out to the boats and performing for them, because you couldn't actually birth in Madras, so they would, they would go out there. So the very first encounter that a lot of Europeans had with India was through its magicians, and that's why I think they thought they were pretty good, and they'd be well worth their while to recruit these guys and send them to England, where they would be performers and earn some money.
Well, thank you so much, John. Listening to you, I was just making a link with what Shiv said earlier, that when you're talking about all these fantastical characters, how wonderfully fluid their identities were, and this whole idea of citizenship and identity being so fluid, and out of that, such creativity emerged.
Absolutely. I mean, the fluidity on both sides. I mean, one of the inspirations for doing this book was, imagining the encounter of an Indian magician who had learnt Western magic and was dressed in top hats and tails, going to England around about 1900, when so many Western magicians, English magicians, were dressed up in turbans and sherwanis. And this actually happened. It was this kind of role play and lovely fluidity. I mean, it was the hybridity of this encounter was what really fascinated me.
And you mentioned about him calling himself the Prince of Baluchistan. Again, some months back in Algebra, we had, an author who's talked about Deccan history and how many Africans came to the Deccan Plateau, called themselves, descendants of the Ottoman Empire, ended up becoming key players in Indian history, fought off the Mughals, particularly one called Malik Ambar, who basically was a slave boy, came to India and said he was from the Sultanate of the Ottoman Empire, So this adoption of identity, citizenship, all of that, good stories to remember in a fraught time now.
Absolutely. I mean, the late 19th century, early 20th century was called the golden age of magic, and it was golden because you had this, confluence of traditions and styles and this incredible interaction. That's what made the golden age of magic was partly thanks to India and its wonderful performers.
Thank you very, very much, John. Thank you for this labor of love. It's a fascinating book, and I'd urge everyone to buy it. Thank you.
Thanks, Shoma.
Thank you.